I'm Anna Getmansky. I'm an assistant professor in the International Relations Department at the London School of Economics and Political Science.
Hi, my name is Professor Chris Alden. I'm with the International Relations Department at the LSE. I also hold a post as Director of LSE Ideas.
I'm interested in the effects of violence and exposure to conflict on individual attitudes and behavior. Originally, I'm from Israel, and naturally, I was interested in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. During my studies, my PhD studies at New York University, I also became interested in how domestic politics affects government decisions and leaders' policies. And so naturally, I started looking at how changes in public opinion due to exposure to violence translate into subsequent policies and actions that government take. My projects relate to the effect of exposure to rockets on public opinion and voting, the effects of the separation barrier that Israel constructs in the West Bank on subsequent violence. And currently, I'm also exploring how exposure to violence in other conflicts, for instance, through exposure to refugees that arrive in host countries, how it affects public opinion of the host countries towards their own conflicts and towards their refugees. And finally, I'm also working in how reduction in the costs of conflict due to adoption of military automation shapes likelihood of participation in conflict and shapes attitudes towards conflict.
I guess the origins of my research interests are to be found in the fact that I grew up in parts of Asia and Africa and ended up doing my PhD on South African foreign policy. In 1990, I had an opportunity with the opening of South Africa to go to the region. I took that opportunity and ended up staying on for 10 years working at one of the top universities there. Out of that flowed my research interests, of course, in South African foreign policy, which brought me there initially, but more specifically, the role of China in Africa, Chinese statecraft, initially focused on development issues, but increasingly in security matters. And so I've written on that subject. The other area is the reintegration of ex-soldiers. Southern Africa featured in the Cold War, and the ending of the Cold War and conflicts in Mozambique and Angola meant that there was the dilemma or problem of dealing with ex-soldiers and reintegrating them into society and into different militaries. My research focused on Angola, Mozambique, and to an extent South Africa in this area.
My research can benefit several audiences. First, I hope to benefit scholars and students who are interested in the questions that I study and encourage them to collect additional data or to apply the same methods to other contexts. In addition, I hope my research can benefit NGOs. For instance, the research that I do on refugees. I've been in touch with several NGOs that deal with refugees, and I hope that some of my insights can be applied to their work. And finally, my work is also of interest to more general audiences, and it affects general debates. For instance, it was cited in the New York Times and Washington Post, and journalists from time to time are interested in the stuff that I study.
The kind of beneficiaries of my research are sort of twofold. One, there's a general academic set of benefits out there in the sense that you're growing knowledge, you are providing a context within which others can understand events or phenomena. Then, of course, there are more specific beneficiaries. And this, when I look at the reintegration of ex-soldiers work, that was partially based in consultancy as well as foundation support. And these were in response to dilemmas on the ground, policy dilemmas. What do we do with these people who had spent a decade in conditions of war? And how do we get them ready to participate yet again in society as contributing members?
Security is protection of individuals and key infrastructures within a state from harm due to conflict, and statecraft is basically how governments translate this need to provide security into policies, or how they make policies to maximize provision of security to whomever they think needs to be secured. And so within this definition, I think the security and statecraft cluster brings together very different scholars from the department that do work on different aspects of these concepts. And so we have workshops where people present their current projects and comment on current projects of others.
For me, it's a great definition because it's broad enough to encapsulate most of the phenomena that's out there. I think but what concurrently, and that's been my experience of the workshops, is we collectively interrogate what security is, and we bring different understandings of that. So this broad definition, which both focuses on the systemic sort of components, and then there's almost a granular ethnographic dimension that some of our colleagues will bring forward, or some of the PhD students, and that it forces us to think about what is, where we position ourselves on the security question. Is it statist? Is it about human security and the broad definitions of it? So I think that's one of the benefits of our cluster. One of the areas I learned about this year that inspired me to go forward was the role of digital IR and digital statecraft in particular. For instance, the phenomena of the Chinese diplomats being characterized as wolf warriors, using social media to really punch back from their perspective at what they say are the assumptions out there about Chinese intentions and what have you. So there's a really interesting area that's beginning to develop of understanding the way we use new technologies or not so new technologies and how they affect the international system and the practice of international relations, statecraft, and the like. For me, the China-Africa story is partly about decentering the research on the traditional research on statecraft has emphasized established, usually Western powers. And I mean, there are going to be some commonalities of practice there, but there are also some distinctive features, and it's also China is, of course, an authoritarian state, one-party state, and has other instruments, the party system with which it actively seeks out to influence and secure economic positions within Africa. We have a powerful state, though still in many ways a developing country, but a powerful state engaging with the regions of the world that are the poorest, some of the poorest, some of the weakest institutional and state structures. And in that context, how do you conduct diplomacy? How do you operationalize your interests in that realm? And then most importantly, the story that's so often scripted out of these systemic big power statecraft sorts of approaches is the role of local actors, the local agency. Because it's there, if you know where to research, it's not hidden, but it's a story that doesn't get told as much. If you look at Africa, it's a sort of hotbed of competition, emerging powers. And why Africa, one would say? I think that to be a global power, you have to have an Africa policy. It's not to say, it's sort of the addition, partly because multilateral institutions, or Africa represents the largest number of states, the biggest voting bloc that tends to vote as a bloc. And so, so you find Brazil, Turkey, even if you want to call it the second-tier states, also moving into Africa to assert their role and their claim as a global actor as a result. Obviously, India is another one as well.
I have been working on integration of Syrian refugees in Turkey, and in a recent survey that I conducted with co-authors among over 2,000 Turkish respondents, we tried to examine how different characteristics of refugees affect their acceptability by the local population. And in particular, we used a method called the conjoint experiment, where we showed each respondent a pair of potential profiles of Syrian refugees that vary by different attributes. Among them was participation in the Syrian civil war, and whether the refugee fought on the side of the government, on the side of the opposition, or did not fight. And so, as expected, people are less excited about integrating former fighters who were on the side of the government. This is because Turkey clearly aligned itself with the opposition and against Assad's government. And so it obviously trickles down to public opinion that is very much against Syrian refugees who fought on the side of the government. However, when it comes to assessing acceptability of opposition fighters, there's a partisan divide within Turkey. Supporters of the ruling opposition party that helps or assists the Syrian fighters are very much in favor of integrating former fighters of the Free Syrian Army, even more so than people who did not fight in the Syrian civil war. On the other hand, those who are not supporters of the governing party are more in favor of non-fighters than non-fighters of the FSA. And so this just shows that public opinion very much follows elite cues, especially on issues on which the public might not have full information. But also that public opinion is quite complicated. So it's very hard to say whether people are in favor of fighters or not in favor of fighters. It very much depends on their partisanship.
I've done a little bit of work on the reintegration of ex-soldiers in Mozambique, Angola, and South Africa, and similar sorts of findings about the public attitudes, perceptions, and responses or reactions to soldiers. What I found surprising was the degree to which, once they demobilized and disarmed, that ex-soldiers began to find common cause in the sense that they saw their own experiences as closer, brought them closer than perhaps their immediate surrounding communities in which they found themselves. So it was a curiosity that you wouldn't necessarily think was going to happen.
So there are many, obviously, explanations for this, right? So it could be that the experience of fighting somehow brings them together, but it could also be the rejection of the non-fighters. And very often in post-conflict societies, people who were not engaged in fighting, they develop this dislike towards fighters on both sides. And this might also, unintentionally bring together the former fighters. But I think it really highlights the difficulty of integrating former fighters. And this is one of the most, I think, important areas in post-conflict societies, because these people have experience in fighting and they know how to use weapons. And so if they're not well integrated, this might have really bad impact on stability down the road in those societies. Absolutely.
I can say that there's very strong evidence that in criminal gangs that have sprung up here and there, that they all share one or two things, and that's experience, networks and experience that are related to fighting the era of warfare and conflict.